This is the Khmer Times News. My name is Paolo Bonini, and these are your headlines. This week marked the anniversary of the fall of the brutal Khmer Rouge. Road accidents are still claiming many innocent lives needlessly, and we have a very encouraging update on the dolphins of the Mekong. But first, our headline story. This week marks the day the kingdom was saved from its darkest age, with the ousting of the genocidal Khmer Rouge regime, a rampaging carousel of death that affected every single member of the kingdom. On this anniversary, survivors spoke with us at the Khmer Times about the brutal regime's final days. Their words are of the end of an apocalyptic era and the beginning of the long road back to a lost civilization.
One survivor told us at the Khmer Times, during the first days of January 1979, we heard gunshots and explosions. I noticed the confusion and disorder amongst the Khmer Rouge. The very next day, the Khmer Rouge started to leave the city, and all the people in Phnom Penh had to go with them. In the next few weeks, we travelled with the Khmer Rouge. We did not have enough food, and we were often attacked by so-called enemies. But when we actually met the Vietnamese soldiers, we were still very afraid, for the Khmer Rouge had told us that the Vietnamese soldiers would cut open our stomachs. They would fill our stomachs with grass and then sew them back up. But when those soldiers approached us, they asked us in broken Khmer, "How are you, Cambodian brothers and sisters?" In return, we all cheered. Another witness told us, "I was living at Ko Along Chen under the ultra-Maoist rule. I was able to escape from being killed by the Khmer Rouge. We heard that Phnom Penh had been liberated, and we all needed food desperately, so we killed the collective livestock and shared the meat amongst us. Alone and with a slab of pork over my shoulder, I travelled to Phnom Penh on foot. On the way, I saw literally thousands of dead bodies, some filled with maggots. I also saw armed forces going into battle. Gunshots were heard for many days and nights. Yet I was not afraid, of course not. If you have survived the Khmer Rouge, there can be nothing else that could possibly scare you." A third witness told us, "I was only 8 years old. Bombs started to fall and they came closer. Our liberation was underway. The Khmer Rouge cadres fled, but revenge was soon to be dished out. A young female Khmer Rouge member who had failed to escape was hacked to death by people in my village. It was exceedingly brutal. But we could not blame them after all they had suffered. Today, some of my students think that war and chaos could be exciting and thrilling. But I always remind them that war brings nothing but pain and suffering."
In a moment, I'm going to show you something. It's my personal notes that I collect over the week to help me structure this weekly news show. What I find most disparaging about the research we do is the continuous stories about death on the nation's road and how very frequent drivers flee the scene in hit-and-run incidents. Here is just a fraction of the stories from recent days, with such headlines as "Mother and Child Killed After Being Hit by a Car," "A 2-year-old girl dies under a truck," and "A man is killed by hit and run whilst crossing a street, and so it goes on. So here, now, is just some of that tragedy.
A man was killed whilst crossing the road. He was hit by a truck at such speed he was thrown 20 metres away. Now that is an incredible impact and amplifies very clearly the speed that some of these trucks travel. According to the report of the Battambang provincial authorities released this week, the traffic accident occurred at 8 o'clock in the evening and the victim was a 58-year-old man. The driver? Well, he fled the scene. Our second case is that of a mother and child. Both were killed after being hit by a luxury car that collided with their motorcycle. In the ensuing accident, the woman, who was only in her 20s, and her 4-year-old son were killed instantly, as the driver was not paying attention to the road and he compounded the danger by speeding. And finally, in our catalogue of carnage, another incident involving yet another speeding truck. The impact this time was so severe, a moto driver died instantly at the scene. The little Honda motorcycle was travelling along National Road 6 when it was hit by a container lorry travelling in the same direction. The victim was a Mr. Yim Art. He was only 30 years old, and as is traditional, the truck driver got out of his vehicle in the late night air and did not attempt to render aid to the young man that now relied solely on him to try and help to save his life. Instead, the truck driver ran from the scene, leaving his victim to die on the road. The issue is certainly multi-layered. Many are calling for an enforcement of driving licenses, others to regulate speeding. But for myself, it is the penalties that may well be lacking. People who hit and run and leave their victims in the road in a cold and heartless action should be jailed. If it is for a single scratch, albeit a decapitation, it matters not. All those involved in accidents must do all they can to help. And if they run, they are only running to a guaranteed jail term.
Recently, we have been covering the woeful state of the sanctuaries that the Mekong dolphins live in. Within the sanctuary, wildlife officials have removed literally kilometres of illegal nets that trap and kill these endangered dolphins, a species so very rare it is on the very brink of extinction. Well, the PM himself has stepped into the fray, just maybe alerted by the spotlight that we at the Khmer Times have shone upon this tragic state of affairs. And what the PM has said is protect these dolphins and stop these deaths.
The PM has instructed that Karachi and Stung Treng provincial administrators are to protect the dolphins in the Mekong River, following a spate of deaths in recent weeks. He instructed that the habitat of the dolphins must be made a protected zone. The PM said strict conservation must be applied along the Mekong River, starting from Laos border all the way to Karachi and Stung Treng provinces. The Prime Minister said Stung Treng and Karachi provincial governors must have strong measures in place to protect the dolphins and are not to rely on the Ministry of Agriculture alone. The PM went further by saying they must zone the river where the dolphins live. No fishing must be allowed in those areas, and people must not enter these designated areas for any kind of fishing, because that can be a great threat to the dolphins. The crowning line in his statement to show his commitment to the dolphins is when the PM said, if officials need anything to complete this work, then they can send it directly to myself, Prime Minister Hun Sen. The WWF Cambodian County Director welcomed the news, and he said the WWF stands ready to collaborate with relevant authorities to support the effective management of this critically endangered species and to implement the Prime Minister's recommendations. The dolphins themselves may just have got the lifeline they so desperately need. This species is greatly endangered, and they are on the very brink of extinction. And just maybe they can recover with these new measures. I, for one, will be keeping a very close eye on this story.
The legal framework of Cambodia is still very much a work in progress, and that framework of law is comparable to scaffolding around a mighty building. As time goes on, so does the improvements to improve the central structure. One new amendment to the law is a great step forward, and that is to stop putting children in courtroom docks to give testimony. The experience can often be beyond harrowing for a traumatized child, but now they should have anonymity to protect them from any further trauma.
The Ministry of Justice has instructed all courts across the country to stop summoning minors for court hearings. A few days ago, the PM urged the Ministry of Justice to ask courts to refrain from asking minors to appear for hearings alongside the suspects, which he said would affect the mental state of the children. Courts are to allow minors to have a defence counsel as their representation during all hearings. And if a minor is living in a remote area and cannot come for a trial, a court official should visit the minor for direct questioning and to make arrangements for them to listen to the procedures that are inside the courtroom. The minor should have a lawyer to defend their case within all those court proceedings. Another important improvement is that if a minor is needed to identify a suspect, there should be no direct contact. The court can use the suspect's photo, which will avoid the child having to face the suspect within the actual courtroom. If a minor's presence is essential, the proceedings should not be made public. This goes an awful long way to protect children who have been abused physically or mentally from having the harrowing experience of facing their tormentors, and will make a huge difference in prosecuting those that harm children.
Good news about the dolphins this week, and we have another good news story. And why not? It's the start of a fresh new year, and as we stand on the virgin land of 2023, we can look across the plains, and ahead of us, we see what is a very encouraging horizon. The economy of the kingdom is in an exceptional state, as Cambodia's economic growth grew to 5.5% in 2022. Now, considering one of the central pillars of the economy is tourism, and that was all but wiped out, that number is extremely impressive, and things only look better.
It was announced this week that Cambodia's gross domestic product grew by 5.5% in 2022, while the tax revenue collected from both customs and taxation grew by 2% more than was expected. Tax revenue collected and custom revenue grew by 122% to a very healthy $3.5 billion and $2.7 billion respectively. Now, these numbers are even more impressive than you may think, because one must consider that with the war that's going on between Russia and Ukraine, this has affected oil prices greatly. They have quite simply rocketed. So to produce such an increased profit is really something that's very admirable. But there is more, for Cambodia is expected to achieve economic growth for this year, 2023, of 6.5%, thanks to the global demand that is most likely to continue with the growth of confidence and further investments. The National Bank of Cambodia reported in late December of 2022 that Cambodia's inflation on consumer products fell to 3.6%. So behind us, in our economic landscape, there was growth. But in front of us, there is even more to be expected. And that also includes yet more expansion and a much healthier country.
And now it's time to look at our sports news.
And just the briefest of looks at the Premier League results, because we spent way too much time on dolphins and road traffic accidents this week. And what we see is Arsenal failed to get a win when they met Newcastle 0-0, just the 1 point. Man U did well 3-0 against Bournemouth. But let's focus on our adopted team, which is Nottingham Forest. And surprisingly, we're going to have fireworks because Notts Forest scored a goal. Hurrah! And better than that, Southampton, the opposing team, did not. So that, by the rules, is a win for Nottingham Forest.
It's time to have a look ahead and see what the weather has in store for us next week.
And the weather this week is, well, rather tepid, if one could use a word. There's a threat of some sunshine, the threat of some rain, and the threat of some cloud. That is, of course, if cloud ever could be threatening. Well, now I think about it, maybe at sea, when you get big dark ones, that could be rather threatening, couldn't it? But the temperature itself, also right in the middle of the road, mid to high 80s. The humidity right in the middle of the road as well, about the 60% mark. And the wind is just a tickle at 3 miles an hour.
This has been the Khmer Times News. You can contact myself at the studio by mailing us at ktnewsstudio@gmail.com. Please do subscribe and comment and stay up to date with all the breaking news by following us on both Facebook and Telegram. This has been Paolo Bonini, and that was the week that was. I'll see you next Saturday for your weekly roundup.